But it is something that I think a lot of people, especially with home studios, struggle with, because the technology can be daunting to learn. There's a learning curve in the DAW and the different instruments and things, plus the whole musical side of it. Do you have any suggestions for kind of balancing
Boy, do
all
I
this?
ever.
Well, good.
This is like one of my main things, and that's the whole right brain, left brain dichotomy, which is not new age woo-woo stuff. I mean, you can actually measure where synapses are firing and things like that. You can see which parts of the brain are being used for what kinds of activities. You can see that the corpus callosum between the two hemispheres is thicker in musicians. I mean, it's just, this is all like physical, verifiable stuff. Now, when people talk about classic records, you know, when they talk about, yeah, man, back in the 60s and 70s, you know, they just had something about them. You know, they're looking in the wrong place if they're looking for tubes. They're looking in the wrong place if they're looking for tape. They need to look here, because what happened was, in those days, you had the artist arting. They were living totally in their right brain, okay? You had the engineer totally living in their left brain, making sure the VU meters were running and the tape was okay and everything was biased in line. And you had the producer, the highest paid of them, who was having to integrate the two hemispheres and be able to monitor the performance while monitoring the technology at the same time. So if Buddy Holly had had to reformat his hard drives, I don't think he would have written the same kind of songs. You know, I mean, he just played. And that division of labor, I think, was crucial to creating that kind of vibe in the studio. Yes, having people playing together and not doing overdubs, that contributes to it, but that's totally in keeping with how the brain wants to work when you're working in the right hemisphere, you know? So that's one aspect. So how does that relate to, okay, you're working in the studio yourself. How do you deal with reconciling technology with an artistic experience? Several things. Number one, you really have to know your program. You have to know it so well that it's just second nature, that you just know exactly where you want to go. Two, you got to have a control surface. Mixing with the mouse is just insane. Editing with a mouse is great, but mixing with a mouse is a monophonic device in a polyphonic world. A control surface is polyphonic. You want to move these faders. I mean, when I do that loop seminar today, and I got an APC 20, got a control surface, it's got 8 faders, you know, and I could not do what I'm doing with a mouse. I mean, it just would not be possible. The other thing is templates, having things that are ready to go. Use of color. Your brain parses color more easily than it does text. So like most programs let you colorize tracks and things like that. If you choose a consistent set of colors, you know, I mean, I do the Roy G. Biv thing, you know, the spectrum so that the lower, like, bass is always red. Okay, you know, and the drums are always orange. And the cymbals are always yellow because they're brass. You know, you come up with something mnemonic like that.
Something that makes sense to you, right?
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to be different for everybody. You know, green for vocals, because green is a social color. You know, that's what's communicating the stuff. The blues are for guitar, because, hey, blues guitar. You know, I mean, it's easy to remember those things. And so you can just like take a glance at something and you know where you're at in the track and what instruments are doing what and how, and you don't have to sit there and think. Keyboard equivalence, another huge thing. It's worth learning 10 a week. You know, so you hit Q or you hit B or whatever, instead of like grab the mouse, go to a menu, you know, customization, things like that. Anything that speeds up the workflow, that makes the workflow more obvious. I mean, I'll tell you a real quick story about why I use the DAW that I use, and I won't mention any names because I'm a gentleman.
That's all right.
But I did a book on mixing and mastering about a DAW, and it was very successful, very successful. And the publisher said, well, we got to do more of these. So I said, well, how about I do this other DAW that I use? And the Sonar, for what I won't mention the other one. And and I said, well, I know Sonar really well. How about I do Sonar? And they said, okay, fine, do the same. You know, we want it the exact same format, same number of chapters, same amount of words. You know, screenshots, cover all the same topics, just in that context. Fine, okay, great. So I send them the manuscript, and they call me up and they say, you know, well, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? And he said, well, this is like, it's way short for the page count. I'm like, that can't be. You know, it's got the same number of chapters. It's got the same everything. And they said, well, it's short, you know, it's got to be longer. And I looked at it, and I'm like, something's not right here. So I started comparing page by page. And in the first book, when I'd say how to do something, it would take like maybe 12 steps. And in the Sonar book, it would take 8. And it would take 15 steps, and it would take 12. And, and over the course of the book, it added up to the point where I lost about a quarter of the pages.
Right.
So that like really made a light bulb go off in my head, you know, about like the importance, because one of the reasons why I was using Sonar, aside from the fact it was the only program at the time that did looping and hard disk recording and MIDI simultaneously. Everybody else had 2 of those 3, but it was the only one that had 3, so I kind of had to use it. But it was also faster. So, and then I've stuck with it. I mean, the thing is, I do a lot of Pro Tools sessions. I do Ableton Live is my on-stage thing.
Right.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the only one I would use on stage. I use Samplitude every now and then because of the mastering capabilities and the, you know, the one-stop shop. I mean, I know how to use all these programs,
Right.
but I've really put my efforts into learning Sonar. So that, again, it can be as reflexive as possible. And the other thing is, you know, with keyboard equivalents, most of them are customizable.
Right.
A lot of things are customizable, so you can have the same keyboard equivalents in
Across
different
all the
programs and
right.
make your life easier. But that's, once the technology becomes second nature, then you can be artistic. Because then the engineer steps out of the way.
Right. Right. Great tips.
So.
Great. Great. So now you're currently executive editor.
Oh wait, actually, let me add
sorry.
one more tip.
Sure,
No,
one
I'm
more
sorry.
tip. No, that's all right.
Wireless keyboard. You now have a remote.
Right.
So when it's time to do vocals, you know, you just take the keyboard with you and hit R or whatever, and
Sure.
you can be recording and all that stuff. That's a wonderful, wonderful little trick, because people are like, oh, I wish I had like a nice remote. Learn your keyboard equivalents. But anyway,
There
yes.
you go. Well, yes. So you're executive editor at EM.
Yeah.
Executive editor at Harmony Central.
Actually, editor-in-chief.
Editor-in-chief at Harmony Central. Right.
Yeah.
Now,
Don't call me chief.
I won't call you chief. And we worked together, of course, at EQ magazine. So a long journalistic thing there. But
Right.
what's interesting is you actually founded EM.
Yeah, and it wasn't even lost.
Yeah, right. It was Polyphony originally, right?
Yeah, it was Polyphony, and then John Simonton. I don't know if you remember
From
John.
Pi, right?
Yeah, John. I mean, the late, unfortunately, John Simonton. He's very much missed in this industry. I sat down with him and said, you know, the world is filled with vertical magazines. You know, guitar player, keyboard, recording. You know, studio sound at that time. I said, we really need a magazine that's horizontal. That's for a guitar player who works in the studio, has a drum machine, and uses MIDI, you know, and that kind of thing. And John was like, yeah, you know, that makes a lot of sense. And I came up with the name Electronic Musician, which is still too long, but it's descriptive.
Right.
And the first 2 issues came out actually under the aegis of John and Linda Kay, his wife, and they put it together down there in Oklahoma, and it went over really well. And at that point, they realized, or John realized in particular, that, you know, I'm not sure I really want to get into it this deep. And they sold it to Mix Magazine. And so that's how Electronic Musician did its thing. And I told them I would do it for 5 years, and I did it for 5 years, because you know what being an editor is like. Right. And so then I went on and did, you know, EQ. Obviously worked with you, which was great. And now I'm back at EM, and because EQ and EM folded together into one magazine. Right. And I was thinking, you know, it's kind of interesting, but I realized that I'm so much into looping. Right. That I've just looped. You know, it's a 27-year loop or whatever, but it's a loop. You know, I've gone back to doing EM. That's great. And have luckily Sarah Jones, who was editing Mix, is now with EM, and you know, she's really well known in the industry. Everybody likes Sarah, and she really does the heavy lifting. You know, I get to be the executive editor, so, so I get to do some writing and stuff, and throw out ideas that people laugh at, but we end up doing anyway, and people like them. And
well, that's great.
Yeah, it's turning out really well. And of course, they're sending me here. Right,
and we're happy to have you here.
So it's great.
Right, right. Greg, thanks for coming in, man.
Hey, thanks, Mitch.
Good to see you, my friend.
Yep, good to see you.
We're looking forward to the looping seminar that's coming up.
Yeah, me too. Let's see if smoke comes out of the computer.
We'll see. See what happens. I'm Mitch Gallagher. Thanks for joining me for the Sweetwater Minute.